Welcome back to the AI Daily Brief. Today we are talking about a really interesting and important phenomenon, some findings from a recent survey that suggest that when it comes to AI, employees do not trust their workplaces right now. However, before we get into that, I want to contextualize this in a broader conversation around the state of AI and jobs right now. A big theme for the last couple of months has been whether or not and the extent to which we're starting to see AI show up in job displacement, particularly around young workers. You might remember back earlier in the year when Anthropic CEO Dario Amodei warned that AI could end up eliminating half of entry-level white-collar jobs, and given his standing in the industry, obviously there was a lot of discussion around that. So far, it's been a lot of tea leaf reading and theorizing, and so I was interested to see this recent paper come out from Stanford University's Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence Lab, or HAI. The paper took a targeted look at how early career workers between the ages of 22 and 25 are being impacted by AI. Now, whether or not it is AI's fault, by some metrics, this has been the worst year to leave college since 2015. NBC recently published a piece called A Black Hole: New Graduates Discover a Dismal Job Market. They write, NBC News asked people who recently finished technical school, college, or graduate school how their job application process was going, and in more than 100 responses, the graduates described months of spent searching for a job, hundreds of applications, and 0 responses from employers. Now, obviously, a news outlet asking 100 people does not a comprehensive data set make, and yet there's definitely a broader sentiment that this is happening in some ways. If you go on various community spaces online, you'll see people complaining about similar phenomenon. What's more, as NBC points out, the unemployment rate among recent grads has been increasing this year and is up to about 5.3% as compared to around 4% for the labor force as a whole. By the numbers then, it's one of the toughest job markets for new grads since 2015. Of course, what's difficult is to understand how much this is about AI specifically versus confounding factors like the reversal of hot tech hiring in 2021 or just general malaise in the private sector. Now, the Stanford paper does try to control for other factors to come up with a definitive answer on whether AI is already impacting the labor market, and ultimately came to the conclusion that yes, AI is having an impact here. The paper highlighted several key findings. Their main one, and the one that you've seen the most statistics probably shared on places like X, is that early career workers entering fields that are highly exposed to AI disruption experienced a 13% relative decline in employment even after the data was controlled for firm-level shocks. The researchers gave the examples of customer service representatives and software developers as some of the professions most exposed. In contrast, employment for workers in less exposed fields saw employment remain stable or even grow. The same was true for more experienced workers in occupations that are highly exposed to AI. You can see this chart that was shared by Mike Bird from The Economist that broke different groups into their exposure quintiles and seemed to find this pattern of higher AI exposure leading to lower job growth or actual job deceleration. The researchers also found that adjustments in the labor force are more likely to occur right now through headcount reduction rather than reduced compensation, and reductions in the labor force were more likely in fields where AI was being used as automation rather than augmentation. In other words, and intuitively, voice agents taking over for call center workers is a challenge, but AI note takers don't seem to pose much risk. Finally, the researchers said that these effects were still visible after controlling for several different factors and remaining consistent across alternate sample constructions. They said, "We find that the AI exposure taxonomy did not meaningfully predict employment outcomes for young workers further back in time before the widespread use of LLMs. The patterns we observe in the data appear most acutely starting in late 2022, around the time of rapid proliferation of generative AI tools. In other words, these patterns are new and at least correlated with the rise of AI." Now, for all of this, the paper is still careful to caveat that the results could be due to factors other than AI. Ultimately, they reduce their claim to state, "Our results are consistent with the hypothesis that generative AI has begun to affect entry-level employment." Still, looking into the data, it really does seem like there are a lot of confounding factors here. Marketing and sales managers is one of the occupations that researchers suggested was most impacted by AI. However, the biggest drop in junior hiring came in the last quarter of 2022. So then if you extend the logic of the paper, you'd have to be arguing that effectively ChatGPT gets released in November and firms immediately stop hiring junior sales and marketing positions. If you ever use GPT-3, you'll realize just how absurd that notion is. Hiring in that field also seemed to recover strongly in the second quarter of 2024 when the economy got out of its slump. The contra example is also a little flawed, with the researchers using nursing aides as the key example of an occupation where young hires are growing. It's probably true that nurses haven't been disrupted by AI, but that's also a field seeing a huge demand spike due to the aging occupation. This is, of course, not to argue that AI is having no effect, but to try to claim that because we are starting to see these patterns in young employment, the only or even main causal factor still might not just be AI. Ultimately, we are still very much in the vibes and sentiment stage of this, not the hard data stage. And I do think that, as opposed to some recent so-called studies from top universities that make big, bold pronouncements about AI, in this case, the Stanford group is just trying to get a little bit of color to start to try to see some signal through what is ultimately very noisy and immature data. I think it's also important that anytime we talk about AI job loss, we also talk about jobs that AI will create. And this is not just me blithely being an industry advocate, although I've certainly been accused of worse in my life. It's that anytime we talk about job displacement from new technology, it's so much easier for us to understand what things that we do now that new technology will be able to do instead of us, as opposed to what new things we don't even consider doing now that technology will create the opportunity for. That is definitionally in the future and harder, if not impossible, to know. And on that front, a new report from staffing firm Birchworks found that AI-specific roles are absolutely on fire. The report found that base salaries for non-managerial workers in AI with 0 to 3 years of experience grew by 12% over the past year. Birchworks analyzed the compensation of thousands of AI and data science candidates to come up with these numbers. The report also found that people with AI experience are being promoted to management roles roughly twice as fast as their counterparts in other tech fields. Anil K. Gupta, a professor at the University of Maryland's Business School, said, "There is a significant salary difference between a machine learning engineer job and a software engineer job." The WSJ added some anecdata from Databricks CEO Ali Ghodsi to confirm. He said that he plans to triple graduate hires this year in part for their AI skills. He said, "They're going to come in, they're going to be all AI native. We can't, for the life of us, get the more senior people to adopt it." Now, interestingly, at the Enterprise AI event that I was speaking at this week in Vegas, a lot of the conversation in some of the breakout sessions was about this phenomenon. I heard a lot of the people who were here in positions of power, CIOs and the like, talk about how they were really excited about young people who were more AI native coming in and helping bring that skill set and that mindset to the organization. I think there is an awareness that many firms are going to treat junior workers like they are not important anymore because of AI, and some other opportunistic firms are going to swoop in, treat them really well, and potentially get the benefits. All of which brings us to this interesting conversation around the relationship between workers and their employers when it comes to AI. If you're not familiar with Kyla Scanlon, she is an economics-focused content creator who's got a big following on TikTok and on other social media and does a great job of explaining and breaking down important economic and market concepts in a way that non-professionals can understand. A couple of days ago on her blog, she published a survey that she had run called AI That Works for Workers. She writes, "AI is at least 4 different transformations happening simultaneously in how we work, how we invest, how we power our world, and how nations compete. We're trying to integrate an unpredictable technology into systems that weren't designed for it. What's happening in this messy middle? I wanted to know how people felt about AI. What do workers think about working alongside these new systems? So I asked them directly." So basically, this is a self-conducted survey. It is not a Stanford survey. It's not even an MIT survey. But Kyla has a big following, and she got 1,200 people to respond to the survey within 24 hours. As she puts it, the entire goal here is exploratory research. This is more meant to be a preliminary exploration of how people are thinking during this time of immense change than to produce declarative conclusions. The survey that Kyla shared had 11 questions. How familiar are you with AI tools in your industry? Have you used AI at work in the past 6 months? What's the biggest benefit you hope AI could bring to your work? What are your biggest concerns about AI at work? What role should workers have in decisions about how AI is implemented? How much do you trust your employer or organization to use AI in ways that benefit workers? Has your employer provided training on how to use AI tools? If you could enact one policy to ensure AI benefits and complements workers, what would it be? And then finally, what industry are you in? Are you a member of a union? And any additional thoughts. She writes, "The responses largely showed a workforce that's not totally enthusiastic nor completely resistant, but they are actively thinking through what it means to work alongside intelligence that isn't quite human, but isn't really predictable either." Now, there is a lot of interesting stuff in this survey, which, by the way, you can go check out at kyla.substack.com. That's kyla.substack.com. But by and large, the thing that I found interesting was the utter lack of trust that employees have with their employers when it comes to this technology. Now, this is not the first time that we've seen there be a gap between employees and executives when it comes to AI policy. A number of times on this show, I've shared this survey from Writer that was conducted last December that surveyed 800 employees and 800 C-suite executives and saw, frankly, a huge gap between how they were thinking about AI in their own companies. When asked whether they thought that their company had been successful in adopting AI over the previous 12 months, 75% of executives said that they had, versus only 45% of employees. In fact, when it came to the simple question of just asking whether their company had an AI strategy, whereas 89% of executives said, yes, of course we do, only 57% of employees said the same. Now, there are all sorts of interesting places that this lack of trust is showing up and suggesting that there are real problems here. That same survey found that 41% of Gen Z employees are sabotaging their company's generative AI strategy, and that of the people who are, a third of them are worried about AI diminishing their value or their creativity. Point being, there appear to be big chunks of people inside companies who are very much not on board with AI strategy, and it's understandable why. If you think that when a company is pushing an agent on you, they're basically asking you to just train your replacement, you're not going to be all that enthusiastic about it. Which is not to say that there aren't things that people want out of AI. When Kyla asked what workers hope AI will do for them, 29% said that they want it to reduce repetitive work, and 27% said that they want it to increase efficiency. And yet they worry that it could shrink their opportunities and that the early state could actually impact negatively the quality of their work. 18% said, for example, that they were concerned about fewer career opportunities. Still, as I said, to me, the most interesting numbers were around the trust or lack thereof between employees and their companies when it came to AI. The chart that you're looking at shows a breakdown by industry of how workers rated how much they trust their employer to use AI in ways that benefit them, the workers. On the more trustful end of the spectrum, you had the healthcare industry. 10% of workers in that industry said that they completely trust their employer, and 61% said that they had some trust. 29% said that they had no trust. Now, I'll pause here to note that in the most trusting industry, there were still about 30% of people, just under a third, who had no trust in their employer to use AI in ways that benefit them. On the other end of the spectrum, we have the real estate industry, where 0% completely trusted their employer to use AI in ways that benefit them, and only 44% had some trust, as opposed to 56% who had no trust. The vast majority of industries here had over a third of people with no trust in their employer to use AI in ways that are beneficial to them, as opposed to just for the company. And just under half of them have over 40% saying that they have no trust. So if you are an executive and thinking about 2026 and how you get AI working inside your organization, it may be useful to consider what your employees currently think about how your organization is going about things. Now, part of the reason that people might not be trustful is that it doesn't necessarily really seem like they're being supported when it comes to AI. The vast majority of workers, for example, in this study, had never received any training on AI. The two industries that had the greatest percentage of people responding that they had received some training was the technology industry itself and consulting. And in those cases, it was still only around 60-40 of people who had been trained to people who hadn't. In consulting, it was 58-42. That means that in consulting, an industry that is so poised for disruption or at least radical change from AI, you still have 42% of workers who had never received any training from their employees on AI tools. And by the way, they want it. When asked for their thoughts on what their employer could do to increase their comfort with AI and their positive relationships with AI, training and upskilling funds was the top answer. To me, it seems inevitable that the more that our focus turns to agents, and especially highly complex agents or systems of agents that can do bigger and bigger chunks of work, the more that you're going to see human employees push back and demand to have a seat at the table. Now, the opportunity, of course, is that for forward-thinking organizations, while other organizations wait too long and struggle with things like employee sabotage, organizations that actually get their people on board, that paint a vision for how AI and agents are going to work at their company and what the implications are for their existing employees, those organizations are just going to so dramatically outperform those that don't do that. Of course, we are still living in a dearth of real data, but as long as the vibes keep rolling in, we will keep keeping track of them. For now, that is going to do it for today's AI Daily Brief. Appreciate you listening as always, and until next time, peace.